Perez. He's now a partner in the Miami office of the law firm McDonald Hopkins. It's over here to your left, to your far left. As a former circuit court judge, he obviously dealt with numerous issues regarding gun laws in the United States. After he agreed to join us this evening, it was also a very happy surprise to know or to learn that he has some knowledge regarding gun control laws in Europe and the Middle East, because prior to serving as a circuit court judge, he was a federal prosecutor assigned to the National Security Unit of the Department of Justice. So that's quite a happy coincidence for us. I also include in welcoming members of the greater Miami community our two consuls, if they'll forgive me, because they have been residents of Miami along with their families since 2009. So in the center there, Gael de Massonneau, who's the Consul General of France in Miami, and Kevin McGurgan, to his left, Consul General of the United Kingdom. Consul de Massonneau's prior diplomatic work includes time spent in Tokyo, Sri Lanka, and the Republic of Singapore, and he will highlight for us the differences between gun control laws in the United States and those in France. Consul McGurgan, whose background interestingly includes work on Afghanistan, the Balkans, and arms export policy, will similarly share a comparative perspective by speaking with us about gun control in the United Kingdom. Of course, we are only lucky enough to welcome these two consuls because of our tie within the FIU community to the Miami, Florida European Union Center of Excellence. So it is our pleasure again to welcome Dr. Rebecca Friedman, co-director of the center, and there in the front row. Roundtables such as this have been taking place since 2008. And throughout that time, we have worked quite closely with the associate director of the center, Christine Cali-Sanchez. She is the driving force behind all of these events. So I'm sorry tonight to be acknowledging all of that work in her absence because she has to be out of the country this week, so she's not able to join us this evening. Initially, this idea of getting together and having some type of transatlantic roundtable was the brainchild of Consul de Massonneau's predecessor, Philippe Vinograda, whose aim was to come here and speak with us and share the French perspective on capital punishment. So we're stepping outside the box today and considering a different, provocative and interesting issue. Consul Vinograda made it quite clear that he was not here to convert anyone to the abolitionist policy, which was probably a wise decision. But his aim was to share the French perspective on capital punishment. And that is an exercise that provided great value for everyone involved. And I'm sure you will agree that our endeavor tonight will provide the same. In the words of Consul Vinograda's countrymen and Consul de Massonneau's, French lawyer Pierre Lepal, when one is immersed in his own law, in his own country, unable to see things without, he has a psychologically unavoidable tendency to consider as natural, as necessary, as given by God, things which are simply due to historical accident or temporary social situation. Or, as I like to tell my students, she who knows one country knows none. These observations animate what is a unique feature of this institution, where all of our students are required to take an introduction to international and comparative law, required to take an international and comparative law elective, and where we otherwise incorporate into all of our domestic law courses what we call a pervasive approach. All of our domestic law courses include an international and comparative component. So gentlemen, thank you for helping us to deliver on that requirement in a unique and engaging way. Each of our speakers are uniquely poised to share their perspectives from their relevant countries of origin, including our own Professor Weisbord, who, as I understand it, will include in his discussion some comments on gun ownership in Canada. Our topic tonight is certainly a timely one. In 2008, the Supreme Court, for the first time in a 5-4 decision, made clear that the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects an individual's right to possess a firearm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. In 2010, this protection was extended as a limitation upon state laws. tonight is also a timely one, unfortunately, due to recent events. Just last semester, in this very room, we gathered together to have a town hall forum in the wake of the Trayvon Martin shooting, where certainly part of that discussion included gun control. Since that time, last month's shooting at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin, July's horrific shooting in a Colorado movie theater, which framed, of course, its own debate. Perhaps predictably, some have argued that controlling access to guns will be the simple answer to preventing public massacres like that movie theater tragedy. Others, including a congressional representative from Texas, says it does make me wonder, with all those people in the theater, was there nobody that was carrying that could have stopped this guy more quickly? With that, I will pass the baton to Professor Weisbord, who will be our first speaker. And I do so with the knowledge that we are all poised to learn from one another.
Thanks very much, Professor Fairley, and thank you for the Center for Excellence for organizing the event. And it's very nice to see the consuls joining us, and you too, Judge. I don't know where I stand on this issue. I just started to think about it when I realized that we were having this event. So my ideas are a little bit in their infancy. I hope that we can discuss this a little bit and that you guys will participate as well, and that maybe my views can evolve and change throughout this interaction. I prepared a kind of a short little text, and this is where I've gotten so far, but I'm far from dogmatic on any of the points that I'm making, and I realize I have a lot to learn still. Every day in this country, more than 30 people are killed by guns. In 2009, there were 11,493 gun homicides in the US. The FBI reports that in 2010, the latest year detailed statistics are available, there were 12,996 murders in the States. Of those, 8,775 were caused by firearms. The victims are, for the most part, young, black, and Hispanic men. Unsurprisingly, the social science literature consistently shows that more guns in a jurisdiction equals more homicide. This implies that we are willing to accept the death of approximately 8,775 people a year, mostly black and Hispanic men, for idiosyncratic ideals of freedom to bear arms that are contained, supposedly, in the Constitution. But does the Constitution really grant individuals the right to bear arms? The answer is far from clear. The Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The question is whether the right to bear arms protects only a state's right to maintain a militia, or whether it also protects an individual's right to bear arms independently of the state's need for a militia. It was only in 2008, in the case referred to by Professor Fairley, D.C. v. Heller, that the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm unconnected to service in a militia. Furthermore, what seemed like a victory for gun owners and the gun industry was actually more complex. Though individuals had a right to bear arms, the federal and state governments could closely regulate them. According to Justice Scalia, writing for a 5-4 majority, the state and federal governments can bar felons from possessing guns, prohibit the presence of guns in such places as courthouses or schools, license gun sales, ban dangerous and unusual firearms, and ban possession of guns in public. After Heller, most courts have ultimately upheld most laws against guns, referring to Justice Scalia's list of permitted regulations. As a Canadian, the passionate resistance to gun regulation in the US is hard for me to get my head around. In Canada, dramatic shootings regularly give rise to increased gun regulation. The 1989 Montreal massacre was possibly the most transformational of these tragic events. The massacre took place at one of Canada's specialized engineering schools. 25-year-old Marc Lépine began his attack by entering a classroom at the university where he separated the male and the female students. Lépine claimed that he was fighting feminism. He shot all 9 women in the room with a legally obtained rifle, killing 6 of them. He then moved through the corridors, the cafeteria, and another classroom, targeting women all along the way. After killing 14 women and injuring many others, he turned the gun on himself. After the massacre, some of the female survivors and the relatives of the slain victims met and began to organize a social movement pushing for increased gun control. They were quite effective at bringing the issue to national discussion, and this became the impetus for Bill C-68, the Canadian Firearms Act. The Firearms Act required applicants to be screened, gun owners to be trained, individuals to follow strict rules concerning gun and ammunition storage, and the registration of all firearms. Laws were put into place that restricted ownership of automatic weapons and high-capacity magazines. Handguns are limited to 10 rounds, and most semi-automatic rifles are limited to 5 rounds. The current Conservative government narrowly killed the long gun registry, but a change of government could very conceivably bring it back. What would it take in the US for shooting to become a transformational moment? I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. What about the Tucson shooting where Jared Lee Lochner shot Gabrielle Gilfords in the head at a political event and opened fire on the crowd? Then there was the Batman shooting in Aurora, where James Holmes, dressed in tactical clothing, set off tear gas grenades and shot into the audience with multiple firearms, killing 12 people and injuring 58 others. Then there was the Sikh temple shooting in Wisconsin, which occurred only 16 days later, where Wade Michael Page, a white supremacist, entered a Sikh temple and opened fire, killing 6 people, including himself. The result of these recent gun killings was a massive increase in firearm sales in the United States. This isn't the transformational moment that helps matters. Are we so much under the spell of some half-baked ideal of freedom that we can no longer process new information? If we're not willing to ban guns, it seems obvious to me that a sober public health approach to gun violence would save a lot of lives without unduly compromising the freedom of those people who use guns responsibly. Something like the campaign to reduce traffic deaths through seatbelts and better designed cars and highways. There are a variety of regulations that have helped reduce gun violence in other countries, including background checks, training courses, strict limits on gun and ammunition designed to kill large numbers of people. But so long as the uncompromising narrative about freedom in the Constitution occupies the rhetorical space, I don't see much hope for a reasoned and calibrated response to this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I guess I'll take it from here. Hopefully everyone can hear me in the back. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm former Circuit Court Judge Jorge J. Perez, and I'm very happy to be here, very proud to have been invited to this great law school that I've seen just explode and grow in my hometown of Miami. And very happy that all of you took the time to be here. First of all, this is obviously a very important topic, as the professors, both professors have alluded to. And as one looks at this from a judicial perspective and also a historical perspective, the first thing we must do is look at the law. And the law is very simple in the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution, which states that a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, in interpreting that decision, that clause of the Second Amendment, there had been for quite some time a lot of decisions that seemed to go back and forth. It eventually became settled law in the matter of District of Columbia versus Heller. The great debate as to whether or not it was tied to the militia or whether it was an individual right was ended by that case, in which Justice Scalia, writing for the majority, found that it was in fact a private right looking at the history of the Second Amendment and its origins, looking at the intent of the drafters of the amendment. He analyzed what it meant, and we have to go back into our history, the history, American history, and the history of the Anglo-American common law to see why it always was meant to be an individual right and not a collective right or the right of the state. Now, like everything else that's problematic with the Constitution, blame can be laid on the English for this. And my British colleague is working his way out of this one. The origins, one of the strongest origins of the right to bear arms came from 1691, the English Bill of Rights, in which, after certain upheavals in England, specifically in disputes with the Crown and the power of the Crown over the noblemen, the English actually passed a law that provided specific protection, and it was written as such against all, that the Crown could not remove weapons from any Protestant. So it protected all Protestants from disarmament by the Crown. If you were Catholic in England in the 17th century, you had a lot more problems to worry about. But it provided an individual right, unconnected to a militia, unconnected to a security force, to own weapons. And the basis was very simple: freedom. The inability of the Crown to seize the weapons of landowning Protestants would ensure that there would be no usurpation by the Crown of the power and the rights of Englishmen. These Englishmen, or the descendants, to an extent, eventually migrated across the Atlantic and settled in the colonies. And the American Revolution, which of course led to the American Constitution, was written by Englishmen to enshrine the rights of Englishmen and Scotsmen and Welshmen, and as those rights were known back then. And these rights were very profound, and it was a great experiment in freedom. And the drafters of the Constitution went back and forth in a great exchange regarding the issue of freedom. And again, the debate was not gun ownership, whether an individual could own guns. The debate was whether or not there would be a standing army versus a militia. The whole focus, the intellectual basis that the Founding Fathers were debating during the Constitutional Convention, which presided over by George Washington, was the question of the existence of a standing army. Many of the founders thought that the standing army could be a threat to individual liberty, much as the Crown had at times in English history been a threat to individual landowners and others. So in fact, there were many attempts to eliminate the presence of a standing army, to restrict it. One delegate, I believe it was from New Hampshire, actually got up and proposed that the standing army of the United States would number no more than 3,000, which led George Washington, who was presiding as president of the Constitutional Convention, to get up and in a sort of a snide rebuttal say, I would propose to the gentleman that we also pass a similar law that no invading army number more than 3,000. So again, really the debate was over the militia, the existence of a militia versus the existence of a standing army. At no point was the concept that free men, and at that time it was a question of obviously the Constitution, and those times we were talking about men and specifically white property-owning males, to own weapons was in dispute. That was never disputed. And in the Heller decision, the court does go into some background into the original heritage from the English common law and the early American experiences, and eventually the articles, the Second Amendment, as described and as written in our Constitution, was passed. There were a couple of revisions to it, but it was focused on the right of the people to bear arms. The militia was secondary because obviously the people had the right to bear arms, and a militia was something that would also provide the protection, the security, and the freedom that could not be trampled upon by a government, because you can't have a militia without armed citizens. By definition, a militia is not a formal army. But it was a personal right, and that's what the Supreme Court versus Heller decision essentially resolved what had been a decades-long debate over whether this was something that was a holdover from the past, whether it was connected solely to a militia, solely to the notion of a state national guard, etc. So the ratification of the Constitution and subsequent decisions, which led up centuries of litigation and centuries of back and forth, was resolved by that. It's interesting to note that in District of Columbia versus Heller, the respondent, Mr. Heller, was in fact a police officer and was authorized to carry weapons. Richard Heller, it's always interesting to look at the facts of a case after you look at the law that applies to the case. And applying those facts to the law, the District of Columbia actually made it, imposed on him restrictions on his ability to have a weapon at home. The Supreme Court, of course, found that Richard Heller, Dick Heller, could actually own a weapon, and there were certain restrictions that were allowed, but not the sweeping violations of the Second Amendment that the District of Columbia had passed. Obviously, the gun control debate has gone back and forth over the last few decades. Whenever there is a tragic event, it always revives the gun control debate. It enters into American political discourse. After the Columbine massacre, it became a great issue of political interest. Many say that the movement by the Democratic Party to essentially adopt a pro-gun control position cost him the state of West Virginia. Essentially, at least for the last few elections, and current elections, because gun ownership is so high in the state of West Virginia. So much so that politically it's almost become an issue like, for example, abortion, that politicians try to avoid because of the intensity of emotion and intensity of feeling on it. So the origins of the American right to bear arms comes from 500 years of Anglo-American common law and the freeborn rights of all Englishmen to possess weapons as long as they were Protestants. Now, the issue of gun control and its relationship to crime and murder, obviously, is something that's also been debated throughout the country and also all over the world. When apples to apples are compared, some of the states of the Union that have the most liberal gun control laws, or very little gun control laws for that matter, have some of the lowest crime rates. States like Utah, states like Wyoming. In fact, gun control laws themselves were relatively recent, the kind of gun control laws that we take for granted today. In the early 1900s, they didn't even exist. The former senator from Wyoming, Senator Alan Simpson, once remarked that when he was growing up, gun control laws meant holding your rifle steady. So literally a person could, in 1900 or 1910, walk into a general store in Wyoming throughout most of the American West and buy a bag of flour, some wheat, and maybe some bread, and a rifle. And that person could be 10 years old, too. There was no gun control law whatsoever. And these states also have some of the lowest crime rates in the country. In contrast, areas like the District of Columbia has some of the most restrictive gun control laws, which led to that law being struck down in the Heller decision, and yet has some of the highest murder rates. Throughout the world, there are statistics, and of course statistics are easily manipulated by any side, but gun control laws, very strict gun control laws exist throughout most of the North Africa, the Middle East, to the extent that there are laws, and these are societies that have experienced a great deal of violence. Of course, speaking to the European example, and although not in the European Union, but nevertheless one of the most well-known European examples of one of the few countries that has probably more gun ownership per person than the United States, it's Switzerland, where gun ownership is mandatory in training for the Swiss army. And men are required to maintain actually weapons and assault weapons in their own homes. There have been recent restrictions in Switzerland in terms of the amount of ammunition. That was a recent change that was passed by the Swiss Parliament, although there wasn't any particular great outcry for that. It was simply something that the political party in power was able to achieve. But Switzerland, where basically most male households have weapons, of course, has one of the lowest crime rates in Europe, in the world. And again, compared, for example, to countries such as Great Britain and France, they have much lower murder rates and much lower rates of violent crime. Switzerland is an example often used by gun control opponents as an example of where freedom is the cause of the crime is not the weapon, but of course the culture. To manipulate the old cliche bumper sticker, the Swiss don't kill people, guns kill people in Switzerland. And they have not had those kinds of issues that we've had here, although there have been debates in the past where there have been some murders and some issues that have attracted some attention. But for every study that shows a relationship with gun ownership and violence, there's a study that shows absolutely no relationship with gun ownership and violence. Countries, for example, Brazil has very restrictive gun control laws and also has a much higher murder rate than the United States, actually. So, in some of the major cities. So the reality is that it has to be looked at as a holistic approach, and that is where the entire culture itself, what kind of culture, disparities in income, the sense of justice, a system of justice that provides grievances, that provides an ability for people who may feel they lack resources, the existence of corruption within the judiciary, within the law enforcement community. Those are things that are more closely tied to gun violence than whether people own guns or not, or whether there's a legal right to own guns. So I would say that as my presentation is that the fact that one owns a weapon does not make one more likely to use a weapon. That's common sense. It's common sense as written in our Constitution. Common sense has been learned over centuries of constitutional law in the history of the Founding Fathers, and common sense that was codified, or a debate that was, for the most part, ended in a hell of a decision. As the professor correctly noted, obviously controls and restraints, for example, on assault weapons, etc., those are certainly viable. But what Heller did decide is what the drafters of Heller saw, which is that from the very beginning, the creation of the Second Amendment was meant to give individuals the right to own guns, to own weapons, for their own self-protection, for whatever, for sport, for hunting. It's unique among developed countries that the United States has this, but then again, our Constitution is also unique among developed countries. So with that, I'll turn over to my French colleague, and he can discuss another perspective.
So as Megan very justly said, we're here to present you a perspective, not a right or wrong. I had the same difficult task when I came the last 2 times in this room, one on nuclear energy and the other one on death penalty. On those tricky issues, my job as a consul, which is to present France and America as best friends, become a little bit difficult because we have differences. The European countries happen to have much more common point, even with Canada, than we have with the USA. When I read the subject, I really felt like I was a student again, and I would be able to perform on gun control a comparison. So the first question that I asked myself, what is a gun? And I realized I had no idea what a gun is, because in France I know of hunting rifle, but I'd never seen a gun in my life. And I would like to ask, just to start, who, apart from hunting rifles, owns or knows somebody who owns a gun in the room? Okay. And I noticed that my British colleague doesn't know either. Probably. But I mean, I know of people who own hunting rifle. I don't know of people who own guns. So to answer the question, we tried with my colleagues at the consulate to find some way to present the French perspective. We'll be very brief on the history to focus on when we had the first big regulation. So the historical perspective is during the old regime, the 18th century and before, only the nobles, the nobility had the right to own guns. When the revolution happened in 1789, there was no more of those nobility privileges, and everybody could own a gun. And as Kevin is going to say after, that was the beginning of panic in Europe, because when Napoleon invaded a lot of countries, you had many more people armed with weapons. So we had the beginning of the 19th century in France, at least, with more of a gun culture than we ever had before and after. But you have to keep in mind what a gun was at that time. It wasn't a shotgun. It wasn't a machine weapon or whatever. It was just a more or less elaborate sort of a hunting rifle. You had really to take time to kill somebody and kill it again. So a bit like a butcher knife, you really have to be astute to become a mass murderer with the kind of weapons they had at that time. So 19th century went on, and we arrived in 1939. And I would like, the reason we stopped in this PowerPoint in 1939 is interesting in my opinion, because it's just before World War II. And instead of preparing France to own guns, and maybe would have been better resistance, the legislature at that time considered that it was better to avoid militias developing just like after World War I in Russia and getting all sort of riots in the street. So this very, very structured law that was adopted in 1939 and that sort of lasted until 2012, when we had a revision of this gun legislation, was based on categories. And as you can see, you have the guns, I mean the really core categories, and then you had sort of lighter weapons, and you arrive in category 8, historic antique weapons. And most of the French people who own guns are in category 7, or, I mean, 5 to 8. That is mostly hunting guns or historical weapons. So the legislation of 1939 is very, very restrictive. Carrying a gun is absolutely prohibited, transporting is very much controlled, and the exceptions are limited. So shooting sports, we have professional shooting experts who go to Olympic Games. We have hunters, and I'll give the number after. We have quite a lot of hunters. We have a hunting culture. And those categories that I mentioned are really limited in their possession. So it's only 70 years after that in 2010 we began to sort of update the legislation. One of the issues was the complexity of the classification, also the way the prefecture, the equivalent of a subdivision of the Ministry of the Interior, could control it. So we short stream it to prohibited, submitted to authorization, declaration, and registration of free. But the idea was exactly the same. You keep the access to gun exactly as you keep kids away from candy. It's very tempting to have a candy, but the ends in terms of diabetes and obesity is quite well known today. And the French perspective on gun is exactly the same. It's tempting to get access to guns the way you were when you're kids, but you should be rather away from it. So when we say more than 3 million guns are on the French territory, it's mostly hunting weapons. And the consequences from the French perspective, at least, is the less guns you own, the less people are killed. So in France, about 300 people every year, not every day, are being wounded by a gun. Among those 100 persons die, and among the 100, only 35 are homicide victims. So in 1 year, only 35 people are killed voluntarily as a design by weapon. All the other ones are more or less hunting accident, and they're more common than one thing. So basically that means 0.5 homicides per 1 million people by firearms. In America, as you said, Professor Weisberg, it's about 12,000 homicides by firearm in 2007. That means 38 per million. That is about 70 times higher than in France. So I don't want to patronize, I don't want to legify. I mean, you people are going to be the citizen of the future and decide what's good for you. But from my French perspective, I'm very happy with the situation we have today. And I've got a counter comment, but I will leave Kevin do his presentation.
Thank you very much, Gael and George, and everybody else for coming here this evening. I've already been, so let me just square one thing away. You can say whatever you like about the English, because I'm Scottish. That's absolutely fine. I take all that in good jest. And yes, I'll come back onto Napoleon as being the driver for the very first act in Britain to put in place gun controls, but for a variety of complicated reasons. But thank you very much for arranging this debate this evening. My purpose here is the same as Giles, as the British representative, is to give you an overview of British gun control, the history of our legislation, our cultural attitudes towards it, particularly in light of massacres that took place in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and to highlight the differences between the debates in gun control in Britain and America. And there are really three sort of things to flag up right at the beginning. The first is, as I mentioned earlier on, Britain has a history of gun control stretching back over 200 years, back to the Vagrancy Act of 1824, which I'll mention later on. And George, you're absolutely right that there is buried within our unwritten constitution in the Act of Succession that line about Protestants having the right to bear arms, but we have built on that with gun control, and there's a general acceptance that there is no constitutional right in Britain to bear arms for self-defence. The second is that there is a strong cross-party political consensus on the need for gun control. And whenever there are single or mass casualty events, the debate is often less about the right to bear arms to protect oneself, as an individual might have done in that cinema, but more about the need for tighter gun control and legislation. And interestingly, those events that have taken place, the government that has put through the legislation has often been conservative, akin to Republicans here in the United States, despite that cross-party consensus. The third is there's a strong public opposition, as in France, to no controls. And with the exception of Northern Ireland, and that is worthy of a paragraph of itself later on, most police officers in Britain are unarmed, and most police officers in Britain want to remain unarmed. They don't want to be carrying a gun and to be seen to be carrying a gun because they don't see that as part of their role in policing. So just a bit of background first of how we've got to this point. As I said, unlike the United States, there's an acceptance that UK residents do not have a constitutional right to possess a firearm for self-defence. Although, as pointed out, the Bill of Rights, enacted to allow the succession of King William and Queen Mary, did set out that Protestants were allowed to bear arms at that time. However, if you go 100 years from 1688 on to 1815, and then the aftermath of essentially war in Europe and the Napoleonic campaigns, there's a greater debate within Britain about the need to control firearms across mainland UK. And this is primarily driven because there was mass demobilisation after the Napoleonic campaigns. And no one was really thinking ahead, so everybody was demobilised and sent off on their way back out into the countryside, and very often that's where they came from as farmers, with their weapons. And the government of the day, whether through a mixture of having to deal with the equivalent of post-traumatic stress disorder at the time, or whether having to deal with violence, decided actually, as part of the Vagrancy Act, which was designed to address the problems of vagrancy, of demobilised soldiers who had no homes to go to, they'd introduced gun control legislation. So you couldn't carry your firearm with you, you'd have it taken off you. And then since then, there have been 3 to 4 pieces of legislation brought into place over the next 100 years. The first was brought in 1870, and that was a requirement for a gun licence. Now that actually was less about protection and more about revenue raising. It was a taxation measure, something we Brits were quite good at doing in the United States and to the USA. Then we had the Pistols Act in 1903, where we sought to control the pistols. And then after the Second World War in 1920, again, mass demobilisation, a concern about political changes at a time of depressed economy, and again, tighter gun controls brought in. A little bit like France, but 2 years earlier, in 1937, again, tighter firearms control at a time when we might be preparing for another type of threat. These were all brought together in 1968 into one comprehensive piece of legislation. And in summary, that legislation has it's quite strict. Individuals must have a specific reason for purchasing and possessing a firearm and ammunition, with a complete and a total ban on handguns. So there are no sort of 357 Magnums, 44 Magnums, Dirty Harry sort of going around. It's a complete ban. Some of the reasons that you can have a gun, if you're a member, as in France, of a firearms club, for sporting purposes, or if you're a farmer and you're looking to control vermin or have pest control on your lands. And if you do have weapons kept at home, they must be held securely under lock and key under firearms cabinets, which are regularly inspected by the local police. 2 recent incidents in the last sort of 30 years, actually the most tragic, unfortunately, but the best example of the British attitude towards holding licensed firearms. The first was in 1987, just outside London, in a town called Hungerford, where an individual, Michael Ryan, armed with a semi-automatic rifle and a Beretta pistol, dressed in combat fatigues, killed 16 people on a rampage around the town of Hungerford, wounding an additional 15 before taking his own life. The second was in 1996, and is known as the Dunblane School Massacre in Scotland, where Thomas Hamilton shot dead 16 young children and their teacher before turning the gun on himself. Some of you may not know, or some may know, that the current US Open tennis champion, Andy Murray, was in the school at that time and took shelter under his headmaster's desk in order to avoid the gunman, and lost a number of friends that day. Each event, both, as I said, took place under a conservative government in Britain, led to strong public and political demands to restrict firearms use and the tightening of existing legislation. And they're still very much in the minds of individuals in Britain today that if you say Dunblane and Hungerford, everybody will instantly sort of remember, what happened, and in particular in Dunblane, the reference to Andy Murray. So after both of those massacres, the Firearms Amendment Act criminalised most semi-automatic long-barreled weapons and private possessions of most handguns over a calibre of .22. Now, there are some exceptions to this. Firstly, some exceptions for some anti-handguns and black powder revolvers, the sort of thing that when we're thinking of the Act of Succession or Succession of 1688 or dueling pistols, those sorts of things are accepted. And one region has a number of exceptions, and that's Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK where personal protection is accepted as a legitimate reason to obtain and own a firearm, and where handguns and semi-automatic firearms are permitted. And that's partly historical, because the changes in 1688 brought a Protestant hierarchy into Northern Ireland, which some of you may know has led to a succession of troubles ever since, very complicated piece of history. Partly also during the last 30 to 40 years, when violence has spilled onto the streets, there's been a need to try and manage that. And a number of people took part in government-authorised militias, such as the Ulster Defence Regiment, and had a firearm at home. However, there are still controls in place there. Certificates for personal protection weapons are only authorised by the Police Service of Northern Ireland, where there's a verifiable specific risk to the life of an individual, and that possession of the firearm is reasonable, proportionate, and necessary measure to protect their life. So it's not a free-for-all. There is an assessment process that will be done against information by the police service. So that's a little bit in a nutshell in the UK. Equally, we're not sort of blind that while strict firearm controls go a long way to preventing the criminal use of firearms and to deaths in the UK, it doesn't unfortunately eliminate the use of firearms by criminals. And we've had in the last 10 days the murder of 2 female police officers in the UK. And so criminals will always find a way to find and use firearms. However, one of the differences between the debate in the US and the UK is in Britain we have a real problem with a knife culture and with stabbings taking place, particularly in urban areas. Unlike, we don't have a problem with shootings other than shootings between gangs. We have random stabbings. We don't have so many shootings, but we have shootings between gangs. And roughly about 50% of gun crimes between gangs in the UK. In 2010, the last figure I'll leave you with, there were 619 homicides in Britain, of which 41 were through shooting. So there's a comparison there with sort of, I think it was 30 or 37 in 2009 in France, and we're roughly the same size of country. That's sort of it. I'm very happy to take questions as we go forward, and thank you for listening to my presentation just now.
I'd say before we open up the floor, is there any member of the panel who would like to have an opportunity to make an additional comment or pose a question to another panel member, or shall we open the floor?
I have a comment. We do all sorts of things as a society that put people at risk, and we know that we're putting people at risk, and for some reason we've decided to do it anyway. When we build a highway, we know that there's going to be people that are killed on the highway. There's tons of other examples like this that I can think of. So I think that there is a way to make an argument that in some way, the gun should be permitted in American society, and if there is an argument that can be built, I think it should start there, about some sort of fundamental value. I just have not found arguments about the fundamental value of freedom to possess a weapon to be persuasive. But if somebody could get one in there, that would be the hinge where I could be persuaded, I think.
I just wanted to add another comment for you to think of. After the massacre in Colorado, the reaction in France and most of the countries in Europe is, why do you have this gun culture? And why the American people don't stop spreading out their weapons? And learning today, I didn't realize that actually more and more people bought weapons after the massacre, shows how sometimes Europe and America can be very different in their reaction in public debate.
Well, I think speaking towards the professor's comments about sort of a global approach, one has to view this as what is each nation's culture and what they focus how the culture relates to both the government and the people. Our Constitution is a constitution of enumerated powers, and our Constitution and our legal system is fundamentally based on maximum freedom for the individual and minimum control by the government over the individual. Let's take the death penalty debates that have been held in the past. The reality is, after some killings in Europe, some murders, the support for death penalty in some countries in Europe actually were the majority of people supported him. There was one poll, I forget when it was taken in France, that the majority of French supported the death penalty. I forget exactly what was the crime that led to that. But it is because that freedom is not available, and that government, the death penalties basically were banned in those countries, even though they often enjoy majority support. So the argument, the libertarian argument is that we Americans can own guns because we are free to own guns. And that's simply a small factor of a full spectrum of freedoms that exist in very few other countries. And the question is violence related to gun ownership, or is violence related to a culture of violence, or a community of violence, or a society that is itself condones violence? And in this country, the tendency has been to assume that even the debate after Columbine is that these are individual choices. And it's the notion of subsidiarity, and that is that the responsibility begins with the individual, and then from the individual flows to the community, and from the community, the local, regional government, the state, the city, family, and then ultimately and finally, and only as the last resort, to the federal government or the central government. And that has been a guiding principle of American jurisprudence for centuries. So there are, again, the statistics can go back and forth, but there are that show that the states and the regions of the country that have the most liberal gun control laws have much lower crime rates than cities and areas and counties and states that have much stricter gun control laws. The French example in 1939 is very badly timed, because the irony is that, in a sense, it proves a point. The passage of the gun control laws and attempts to reduce violence in any one particular country isn't going to affect, or one particular society may not affect, a neighboring society. And unfortunately and tragically, it had no consequence there, because there was, to the east of France, a country that was in the midst of convulsions, that was in the midst of grievances, and had allowed a dictator to rise to power and create a culture of violence. So all the gun control laws in France didn't prevent the most violent war in the history of the human race from beginning, or had no effect on it. Well, it might have had an effect if there had been a resistance, but we can speculate as to that. Again, is it the individual? Is it the culture? Is it the community values? But my view is, I agree with Justice Scalia, my view is that it's the individual responsibility. And you can have all the gun control laws in the world. Those who seek to inflict harm, whether they use knives, daggers, sticks, bats, or mortars, will find ways of doing that. And for every statistic about a country that has a high, or a state or a region in the United States that has a high violence or a high murder rate, there's an equal statistic about a region in the United States that has a very low crime rate because it has minimal gun control laws, or at least the gun control laws are irrelevant to the individual decision to commit that crime. And that's what I think the American fundamental premise is that it's the individual responsibility. It's not the government's or society's responsibility to impose upon the individual that restriction.
I'm sorry to be controversial, but I might start some reaction in the room. On the fact that Utah and DC have got different crime rates, I find it quite dubious to consider that it's linked to the legislation, because it's so easy to go to another state to buy a weapon and to bring it back in some sort of way. In Europe, most of the countries have harmonized this gun control, and so it's equally difficult to go to Germany or to Britain to try and get a weapon. And on 1939, yes, maybe it was badly timed, but the belief in France at that time was the army, the national army, was in charge of protecting the citizen. And precisely at the time when we saw Germany looming, we didn't think we should get armed and in the street, because that could create some kind of chaos. So I do take your point that actually the American culture is embedded in the individual right against the state, but the argument that 1939 was a proof that it doesn't work is out of context. At that time, the belief was let the state do their job. Maybe it was misconceived, but I don't think so.
Do we have some questions from the floor?
Any questions?
We have a microphone, yeah.
This is questions to the Consul General for the Republic of France. You got this lovely little slide here showing how minuscule, fractionally, homicides committed with firearms are compared to the United States. But your colleague from Britain pointed out that most violent crimes in the UK were committed with other means. Does that hold true for your country as well?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier on, I mean, it's more difficult to do a mass murder with a bat or a butcher's knife. And so we have similar kind of pathetic people who want to use weapons, force, who kill people, their wife or whatever. But it's more difficult to do it with a machine gun than it is to do it with a knife. So that's the reason we also have crime, like in Britain, but not so much due to firearms.
Thank you. This can be referred to any of the panelists. I want to connect a little bit of what Professor Waterford said about the amount of people, Hispanic and African American, that are killed every year by gunfire. And I would like to connect that with the welfare system that both UK and France enjoy. I would like to hear from all of you, would you say that this system, the welfare system in which more or less all people are protected by the state, has to do with this discrimination that I think many Hispanic and African Americans live here in the States that are discriminated in regards to opportunities, has to do with violence and not more about quantity of guns that exist?
So if I understand the question, you're posing the point that people on the welfare state are more prone to violence?
No, the other way around. That people on the welfare system,
Yeah.
You are saying that you have much more lower rates of violence in both of your countries than here in the States.
Yeah.
Because you have a system where education, health, and many of the basic needs are constantly government offers them to people. And here in the States, more or less, Hispanics and African Americans are, in cases of health information and it's more or less than.
I mean, that's, I'm not sure that is the case. It's a very complex thing to analyse violence within societies because there'll be various different drivers for it. You know, I'm very proud of sort of my welfare state, and I'm very proud of you know, what it does sort of for people. And you know, you have welfare systems here in the United States as well. You know, I have to get sort of sucked into this debate. You know, it's one way or the highway and things. You know, violence. You know, we have a gang violence problem in urban areas in Britain, and that's particularly predominant amongst Caribbean black community. There have been a number of special programs set up for that over many years. But you know, some of you may have been to the UK and you may go out in a town on a Saturday night out, and it's pretty horrendous what some people can do under alcohol at the age of 18. You know, one of the things that I've shifted my view on in the time in the States is I much support, you know, the right to drive a car earlier, because I think it gives more responsibility to individuals, and to have alcohol later. I'm sure my sons agree with me, but that's where we are. I'm not, you know, other than sort of the problems within a number of different communities, I'm not sure I can really draw a link between sort of our social welfare program saying because of those we have less violence in the UK.
I think it's an interesting question. It's difficult to answer, but you might all have seen on the television some kind of riots in France at some point in the past, and that happens mostly in the suburbs of big cities where you have a rather big immigration concentration, and people who are outside of the net, who are long-time unemployed, who are not trained, will have a tendency to turn to drugs and then to buy guns, and there is gun trafficking in France. There are people who manage to get guns and who burn cars and who are aggressive towards police people, and usually those people are outside of the network. So, like Kevin, I would say I strongly believe in my social security network because it provides general coverage, but we have some gaps, some holes, and in those situations, those minorities turn to violence quite easily.
Well, I would say that it's also a fascinating question, whether there's a relationship between, I guess, the social safety net and violence in general. There's one that, again, arguments can be made very effectively in both directions. For lack of a better term, the ghettos that are outside the city, major cities in France that are mostly populated by young African or Muslim immigrants, where there's been a lot of violence. These are areas where there is substantial welfare available, and in fact, unemployment is rampant. But there's also a sense of grievance, a sense of being excluded from the system, a sense of being left out of what it is to be French, and also in a sense an assault on their culture from a society that is very secular and very proud of it, a republic that bans religious symbols of any kind. So it's a very complex question, has many different levels. Again, if you look at history, I have an interesting statistic that I just want to read out that according to the United Nations International Study on Firearm Regulation, England in 1994, not Scotland, but England, its homicide rate was 1.4 per 100,000. And 9% of those were involved firearms. That's much lower than the United States in 1994. But in 1900, when England had absolutely no gun control laws, its homicide rate was 1.0 per 100,000. So I believe culture, I believe the strength of the family unit, I believe the strength of the community has more to do with violence or the absence of violence than either government social safety nets, the existence of welfare programs, and whether or not there's the right to own weapons. I believe it's more about the culture.
To prove the point, as we were saying earlier on about statistics going up, well, in England and Wales, so we'll include the Welsh in this one, in England and Wales in 2009, there are 0.073 recorded intentional homicides committed with a firearm per 100,000 inhabitants. The figure for the United States was 3 per 100,000, roughly about 40 times higher, and for Germany it was 0.2. So, yeah, I actually share the view there is something about sort of culture and individual responsibility, but my government would also say there is something about government setting standards that play a role in this.
Thank you. First, I wanted to mention that both the French consulate and the British consulate mentioned that in their presentations, no control as to strict control. I wanted to mention first that we do have some control, although I tend to agree that not enough. So most people that are proponents for guns are not proponents for no control, are not proponents for full every man for themselves, pick up whatever gun you can control. We do like some controls. This question is more directed at Your Honor, who has some experience here in the United States with crimes here in the United States. Where do you feel, maybe personally, that although we do have some restrictions, our restrictions are too minor or too lax, where a private owner can sell a firearm to another private individual basically by nothing other than a private deed of sale? And if so, how much do you think that organizations like the NRA have in politics, we're not allowing legislation to really do what's best for the country? Although I would like to preface all of that with, I am a gun owner and someone who is an advocate for guns, but I do think that there is a fault in our system where it's too easy for the wrong people to get these guns. Thank you.
I would agree with the basic premise of what you're saying. It is too easy for people to obtain a lot of things, not just guns, but drugs, etc. And as you correctly pointed out, no one is for unrestricted access to guns. And again, we have to deal with the cultures that we have today, specifically in marginal areas where people feel marginalized and violence is a way of life. And in those places, stricter gun control would, I think, be effective. As a circuit court judge, I saw, obviously, on the felony level, a great deal of acts of violence. Obviously, by definition, I dealt with these on a daily basis. Again, I have to fall back on the individual responsibility, though. Ultimately, it comes down to that. But if individual responsibility is affected by so many other things, it's such a complex thing, from where destruction or the existence of a family, existence of support for education, existence of a community to provide support for the individual. It's a holistic thing. And would a law make certain parts of Dade County less violent? Not really. A stricter law would have a de minimis effect, based on my experience. It would have some effect, and I guess one could argue if one life is saved, that's worth it. But again, it comes down to individual responsibility. It comes down to the culture that exists, the family, the community, or the absence of that. And that is a great, big, complex mesh of questions with no easy answer.
I really like your comment and question, because looking at America, we know there is a gun control, but there's a flaw for me. It's difficult to decide whether you, as a gun owner, will be the same person in 1 year or 10 years' time, but you still have a gun. Mm-hmm. Or you might have your sister or your brother who has, for some reason, access to the gun. And that's why I feel very uneasy when one says in America there's a gun control. The second point on the same line is, on my way back from Jacksonville today, I saw on the side of the road the biggest weapons store in South Florida advertised on a huge billboard. And that really made me shiver, because that sort of contributes to the idea that weapons are part of culture, are part of a fun way of life. So I do take your point, there's a control. And on subsidiarity, on a more constitutional term, I really feel that it's for the federal state to regulate that kind of thing. Because, as I said, it's so easy from one country to another or from one state to another in a federal unity like the USA to bring the weapons that are easier to get outside. In a same sort of way, I mean, alcohol is the same issue. I mean, alcohol is a slow poison, but if you consider that a county can regulate, it's ludicrous. I mean, during my holiday, I went to the west of the USA, and the Navajo reservation is without any alcohol. But you find so many bottles on the side because you just have to drive 10 kilometers to the biggest Navajo town to buy as much alcohol as you want. So you cannot really decide that it's possible to regulate on issues like that. For me, it's really a federal matter.
Just to comment on that, and that's of course it's understandable from a French perspective, a European perspective, but you would have to significantly amend our constitution to eliminate what we have, which is a federal system. We don't have one state, we have 50 states and 51 jurisdictions, and that has created the most dynamic economy and provided the most opportunities for more people than any other country in the history of the world. And that's just, I'm not running for president, by the way.
Wow, that's a break. We're very glad to give it to you.
Yes, I have a comment and a question. One concerning the constitutional decision and Justice Scalia's dissenting opinion about gun control and its legitimacy, I guess, of the Second Amendment. The fundamental thing I don't think it answered is intent. At the time that that amendment was put in was the intent to protect a growing nation, which I think everybody here can understand, and the threat of invasion, ironically, from the Brits, who we defended with money from the French. So life is fluid. But I think that this...
French guns, by the way.
French guns, exactly. So I think that, at least in my opinion, I think it ignored the intent of today's current gun owners. When you go out and buy 1,000 rounds of ammunition, in essence, I mean, who are you defending against? So I think it ignored that. My other comment is, in America, and anybody can speak to this, we only talk about gun control when it happens in a certain place in a certain time. For 30 years, we had mass killings in Watts and Compton, in the inner cities of America, and there was no talk of gun control. With all due respect to the lives that's lost in Columbine or in Colorado, the lives lost in Watts, which weren't all gang members, or in Compton weren't all gang members, or in Philadelphia, or in Atlanta, or even here in Miami, weren't all gang members. They weren't all gun owners. But there was no talk of gun control. So if somebody could speak to, I think the issue is not so much the gun, the bullet, or necessarily the person. It's the persons that are pulling the trigger and the persons that are not pulling the trigger and the reasons why. And, you know, just to that issue of why is that gun control talk after certain events and not others. I mean,
I agree with the basic premise is that these debates only flare up when these crimes occur essentially in some middle class or white setting, predominantly white schools. They don't occur. The debates do not occur, and they should occur, where you have decades and decades of rampant violence as has been the case in many of the marginalized areas of our large cities. And that's very true, and that's a very telling indictment of our political system. Politicians only bring it up when white middle class kids are the victim, but they don't bring it up when Hispanics or when blacks are murdered. And the debate should be a debate all the time, and what our country needs to be and what our rights are as Americans. But I keep going back to this because I believe in the case of where anti-crime initiatives have been most successful, it has been enforcing or empowering communities to defend themselves in the sense of to watch out for themselves, and these communities begin to develop a sense of community and a sense of protection for each other. And again, I go back to the individual, I go back to the community, I go back to the family, I go back to the culture. In many of the areas where you have the most gun violence are the areas where you have the weakest community structure, where you have children being raised by themselves, and you have no support system. The solution to that violence is not going to be stricter gun control, because those who are going to commit those crimes will still commit those crimes. It's to create stronger communities, and whatever it takes to create those stronger communities. That's how you reduce crime, gun-related crimes in the long run.
I would like to go back to your comment, but my initial comment on what gun means. And there was a very interesting article in The Economist about 10 years ago that put things into historical perspective. A gun in the 18th century at the time of the Second Amendment was usually a fork. I mean, not even a gun with powder, just something, a stick. In the 1870s, after the Secession War, a lot of people started having gun as their culture. They came back from the war with the gun, and that's probably the most massive expansion of gun culture in America. But today, as we discussed, the gun is a machine gun, is a much more killing weapon. And what the article was pointing out is the NRA in the 60s, at the time probably of Vietnam War or just after, created a third layer of authorization of guns in America. And that's why I felt very uneasy initially with the concept of gun control, because we have to define gun before having perspective on it.
Hi, first of all, can you hear me? Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming here tonight. I know it's late, and you're all very busy. I just want to bring up one point that keeps sticking into my mind. I'd love to get the foreign perspective on it. The United States is roughly, I looked it up, roughly 250 million, a population roughly 250 million, whereas France and Britain are in the 65, 67 range, around there. To what extent do you feel that your systems could ever be applicable to the United States as a whole? I just feel personally that we have such a huge population. For me, I'd rather have it and not need it than to need it and not have it as far as the firearm is concerned. I feel that there's a lot more people, meaning a lot more potential threats out there. And I did want to say, at the foundation of the country, the Second Amendment, to my understanding, as limited as it may be, was to not only protect the nation as a whole and its progression, but it's also to have the people have arms and a means to protect themselves against the government, if it ever came down to it, where an oppressive regime would, take control and oppress the American people. That's something that I've kind of been thinking about, and I just want to get any and all perspectives on it.
Can I just say to our guests, who we're so grateful for your time and your presence. We really have actually already run over time. So if you would like at this stage to address some of the issues that were just raised, or if there's anything else that you would like to say in closing, we would love to hear either or both.
So, to answer your question about the applicability of UK legislation here in the United States, my apologies if I take it right out of context. In my career, I've served in over 15 countries around the world. Most recently, in the last 5 to 10 years, I've included Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the lessons I've learned from there was very very strong lessons has been working with the grain of the culture of the host country that has allowed me to work there. So, there was no point trying to build a version of Sussex in Iraq because the culture just wasn't going to gel. And equally, I think, when I look at the tightness of British gun control legislation, and I apply it to the United States here, we're talking at least a generational shift after something, and a political consensus to take place across left and right before you can even get anywhere near beginning, in my view, banning of handguns and semi-automatic weapons. I just don't see it taking place in that generation. I think the debate tonight has been really sort of interesting. I certainly walked away with some fresh perspectives here in my book. I hope that tonight you walk away and you go do some further research about the British and European models and come to your own conclusions about the things. And certainly, I say to you tonight, in my mind, in my own government's mind, restrictions on the use of semi-automatic weapons, on the use of handguns, seems to be a very sort of sensible thing and practical and common sense arrangement for a modern society to have.
I can only share what Kevin said. I would just like to go back to the geopolitical comparison. I mean, the comparison is not between the USA and France, but USA and Europe. We are about 500 million in Europe, and we have a lot of different cultures, but there are some elements on which we are very much harmonized, and it's an individual decision of each state when they join the EU to, for example, ban death penalty as a corpus of law. Of course, to respect economic freedom, etc. But progressively, we have an harmonization of a lot of basic political issues. So I think it's up to the USA. I sort of see a trend in death penalty progressively being condemned by more and more states. Maybe, as Kevin said, in one generation the debate will be different. And on the gun, it's probably the same issue. The more massacres you'll have on university campuses, or the more Gabby Gifford would be shot during a peaceful political meeting, probably the more people will wonder, why do we have this gun culture? It's not just about poverty. It's also about the state, and the federal state, I insist on that, setting the rules to leave the individual being happy and free and prosperous.
Well, from my closing perspective, it would be, I think you've raised an excellent point, and you have to compare apples to apples. This nation the population is closer to 300 million, with every single ethnic and racial group on Earth living together, with many different religions, many different regions of the country. The solutions that work in smaller countries simply can't be applied. Comparisons should be made to, say, crime rates in Brazil, or crime rates in India, or crime rates in other similarly large nations. And again, it comes down to, this is a law school, and our nation is a nation of laws, and we have a constitution, and that constitution has served us well in times of great strife, including our Civil War, and it has survived. And any change such as that which has been discussed here would require a dramatic change in our Constitution, not just our culture, but in our Constitution. And there are many things that may be improved upon, but I think when you look at it from a historical perspective, our Constitution is the best legal system in the world, and it has been the best in the world, and I'm not about to change it.
Thank you. I'll pass.